Okay. And ideally, you also want to put your page numbers that you were referencing or writing about. I'm going to put page 67 so that I know that that is where we're getting our information from. So what do we usually have before we have our focus statement? We were just talking about our focus statement, but what usually comes before that? Anna Lynn? Introduction. Okay, so how could we write an introduction sentence that would fit the focus of this paragraph? Does anybody have any idea of an example that they would use to just to introduce this? Rocco? Okay, so let me help you out. What does the reader need to know? If we are just talking about the question, why do polywogs wiggle, what information might the reader need to know before they even answer that question? Before they even answer the question. Lucy?
You were wondering if you were wondering why polywogs wiggle, you might know.
Okay. So what information would we need to know about this question before we even answer the question, why do polywogs wiggle? What else would we need to know about this? Margaret?
What are polywogs?
Right, what are polywogs? So we would want to know what a polywog is first, right? Because if we don't know what a polywog is, we're not even going to know what they're talking about when someone says that they wiggle. So we would maybe explain what a polywog is. So that could be a good way to introduce our reader to the subject of the paragraph. So knowing that, does anybody have any ideas of what they might write as an introductory sentence for this paragraph? If we want the reader to know, we know that the focus is why do polywogs wiggle, but we also want the reader to know what a polywog is first. So how can we introduce the reader with a sentence that describes that? Anna Lynn?
A polywog is a tadpole, which a tadpole is a baby frog.
Okay, good. So Anna Lynn says a polywog is a tadpole, which is a baby frog. So do you guys agree that that would be a good introductory sentence? And I like that Anna Lynn describes not only what a polywog is, but also explaining what a tadpole is, so that if the reader has never heard the word tadpole before either, they would still know what they were talking about. So I'm going to write our introduction in purple, our introduction sentence. Okay. So a polywog is a tadpole. Okay. And now I'm going to put a comma and say which, because I'm explaining what tadpole is now, is a baby frog. So what does this tell the reader? This tells the reader that this paragraph that they're about to read is going to be about polywogs or tadpoles. So what comes after the introduction sentence? Focus statement, right. So who wants to share what they wrote down as the focus statement on their paper? Naomi?
They have to move to swim like a fish. It's like the focus statement is like quick swimmers, like they have to move to fish.
Okay, so they have. Okay, so they have to move, so they swim like fish. Who has another one?
Last night I had like an allergic reaction and my legs started really
They
itching.
wiggle to get to land.
Now it's doing me.
That's a good one. Okay, Ian, do you have a focus statement written down?
I don't know, just really good.
Pollywogs wiggle to swim and they swim like this.
Okay, pollywogs wiggle to swim. Max, can you share yours with me? You don't have one written down? I'm sorry?
I don't have one.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. Kale, do you have one?
Yeah.
What did
They
it say?
swim like fish and their tails like fish fins.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of you guys are saying that pollywogs move by swimming like fish. Why do they swim like fish? Why don't they just walk? Cash?
They don't have legs.
So they don't have legs, right? Right, so pollywogs don't have legs, so they swim kind of like fish. So maybe we should include in our focus statement that pollywogs don't have legs. So I think to write a sentence to explain both of those things, maybe we could say, pollywogs move, do you have an idea, Ian?
I have one.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Pollywogs swim like fish because they don't have legs.
Okay, pollywogs swim like fish because they don't have legs, or pollywogs move by wiggling because they don't have legs, because they're kind of more like wiggling than swimming exactly, don't you think? I kind of think pollywogs would be more like wiggling or shaking. So let's say pollywogs move.
Mm-hmm.
Pollywogs move by wiggling because they have no legs. So now the reader knows that that's how they move, and it's because they don't have legs. So that kind of gives them a visual of what they look like and how they move. All right, so what are we going to add after we add a focus statement? Does anybody have an idea? Eden? What are we going to add after we add a focus statement? An idea or like a detail, right? Okay, so what kind of details would we want to include in our class draft? What details would be important? Does anybody have an idea about what would be important when we're talking about pollywogs and describing how they move? Josephine?
I think that would be important to point out what they grow into.
What they grow into, okay. All right, so that's a good point. We can add a sentence like that maybe at the end when we're telling about how they grow up. What about how they live or how they survive? Could we like write a sentence to describe the main points about kind of how they survive? So what about how they breathe? How do pollywogs or tadpoles breathe? Lucy?
If they're close enough to water, then they can breathe through their fin.
Okay. What about like when they're really little, tiny little baby tadpoles? Kale?
They breathe through their gills.
They breathe through their gills, right? So we could describe that tadpoles have a mouth and a tail. As we said, they don't have legs, so they have a tail instead of legs. So we could describe that they have a mouth and a tail, and they breathe through their gills. So what does that kind of describe? What detail does that add to the paragraph? Does it kind of tell the reader a little bit more about polywogs, not just how they move, but just about them in general. So I'm going to write, let's use red. I'm going to write a detail to add to the paragraph. It's going to tell more information about tadpoles. Tadpoles have a tail and a mouth, but they breathe through gills. They breathe through their gills. So, oh, and they live in the water. We could write a new sentence for that. So, somebody give me a sentence to describe how they live in, or where they live at, knowing the information that we know about amphibians. Eden?
They live in like wet, damp places.
Okay, they live in wet, damp places, or they live in water. Max,
They
could you
live
reword that?
partly in land and partly in the water.
Okay, so, that's true about amphibians, but I feel like when we're talking specifically about tadpoles, do they mostly just live in the water, or do they live on the land too?
They mostly just live
I think they just live in water, right? Probably or tadpoles can't go on the land if they only swim. So I would say that we could write a sentence that just says, I'm gonna also do this in red since we're just adding another detail. I would say that for just this paragraph, since we're just telling information about polywogs, we could say tadpoles live in wet places, or we could say tadpoles live in the water. So I'm gonna say tadpoles live in water or ponds. Just to be more specific, but also know that we're not talking about all amphibians, we're just talking about tadpoles. Okay. All right. So what does tadpoles living in the water, how does that connect to how they move? What does them being in the water connect to the way that they move and get around? Gray, what do you think? So we just wrote a sentence to describe that they live in the water. What does that have to do with how polywogs move, which we described in our focus statement?
They get,
She said that.
Okay, does someone want to help them out?
She said that.
Easton, do you want to help Gray out and tell me, what does tadpoles living in the water have to do with how they move, the way that they move?
so if a tadpole is in a pond, if you, they need to move to like get out of the water.
Okay, they need to move to get out of the
Yeah,
water.
like, you can't just like if we try to, if I was gonna swim, you don't just sit there. and do
Right,
nothing. You're
so
not-
they have
you're
to
not
get,
gonna
they
move.
have to be able to swim to get around easily, right?
Yeah.
Eden, do you wanna add to that?
And they have to, they can't, like, there's also some things that, like, would like to eat the tadpole, and so they always have to be moving.
Right, so they have to be moving. So let's add another detail to our paragraph to talk about how they, how moving has to do with them getting around in the water. So we could say wiggling helps tadpoles to get around in the water or to get around in ponds. So wiggling. And I'm still gonna write this one in red just because I'm still adding a detail. I'm not ending my paragraph yet. Oh man, I wrote wiggle instead of wiggling. Okay. This is why you have to make sure you're using the right verb tense. Wiggling helps tadpoles move, or we'll say get around easily. Alright, wiggling helps tadpoles get around easily. So how can we describe how they move their bodies, or how they move their tails since they don't have legs? How can we write a sentence that describes how they move? So think to yourself, think about what you wrote about polywogs in your notes, and think about the pictures that we saw on the text on pages 6 to 7. So do you remember the picture of polywogs? Think about how they look and what you know about polywogs, and tell me how you would write a sentence to describe what they look like when they move. Anyone besides Lucy and Margaret? George?
Maybe their tail goes like back and forth, and they like slowly.
Okay, their tail goes back and forth. What could you compare it to if you were going to compare it to something in your sentence? Liza, what would you compare it to? Like, what does a polywog kind of look like when it moves? Cash?
It looks like its tail is not only shaking. It's like it goes like
Okay, so
its whole body.
so they wiggle their tails to move, but what do they kind of look like whenever they move? Mela? And the dog wagging its tail, okay. Or some of you guys said earlier that it looks like a fish, right?
Sunfish.
So I think polywogs we know that they're not the same as fish, but they kind of look like fish or move the same way as fish whenever they swim. So maybe describing this to the reader could help the reader have a visual or a better understanding of the way they move by comparing it to something they probably already know. So we can say, we'll just say they wiggle their tails like fish. Like fish, or like a fish. So, do you guys think that having this introduction sentence, having a focus statement that answers our main question or our focus question, and then we have about 3 details here that describe tadpoles or polywogs. So what else do we need to add to our paragraph? Conclusion, right? So a conclusion statement. Who can remind me, so think back about writing, when we were reading and writing informational text before, think about what the conclusion statement included. So remind me, what do you think about when you write a conclusion statement? Xander, do you know what you would think about when you're writing a conclusion statement? What might you refer back to in your writing? The title, yeah. Maybe to the title if the title is answering a certain question like it is in our case. Who wants to add to what Xander said? Libby? Do you know what you might look at when you're writing a conclusion statement? Think about before when you were reading informational text and the conclusion statement was really similar to something else. What is it similar to? To the focus statement, right. So, do you guys agree? So we are going to refer back to our focus statement when we're writing our conclusion. What else do we kind of want to explain? So one of you, I can't remember which one said it, but when we were writing our details earlier, one of you said that we would maybe describe what they changed into, right? So do you think that would be a good thing to add to our focus statement? So who can tell me a sentence that describes what polywogs turn into and in a way that connects it back to our focus statement? So we wrote our focus statement in green, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Who can think of an idea? Give me a second to think about that. Think of a way to conclude this paragraph by also connecting it to the focus statement and describing what polywogs change into. Anna Lynn?
As you can see, polywogs are baby frogs and they wiggle.
As you can see, polywogs are baby frogs and they wiggle. So, are polywogs the same as frogs, or are they going to turn into frogs? They're going to turn into frogs. So they're not quite baby frogs yet. They're kind of like just about to turn into frogs, right? So maybe how can we reword the part where Annalyn said they are baby frogs? How could we reword that to describe it a little bit more clearly and accurately? Rebecca, do you have an idea? They're a frog but not fully grown yet. Okay, so they will fully grow into a frog, right? So maybe we could say tadpoles will turn into baby frogs, or we could say polywogs, since we use polywog right here in our focus statement. We could say polywogs are going to change into baby frogs. Maybe let's describe it by saying over many weeks they grow legs and change into frogs. That way the reader kind of understands how they develop, if that makes sense. Or understands how they survive. So let's say over many weeks. Over many weeks, they grow legs and change into frogs. we're going to connect this to the focus statement by saying, but until they do, wiggling is the best way to get around. So is that kind of how we would word that? Does that sound good? Okay, so, but until they do, come on in here, because you're filling up our paper. Until do. I know, it does, it looks like a lot of writing because I'm writing on this big chart, but really this is just as much as you guys wrote on each of the pages of the story you wrote in the last unit, so it's not even that much. What they do, wiggling. Why do you guys think I put an exclamation point here? Gosh.
Like say, but until they do, wiggling is the best way to do it.
Right, so maybe I'm just saying that with a little bit more expression when I read. Right, so when you see that exclamation point, that kind of tells the reader, oh, okay, I'm going to say this a little bit differently with a little bit more enthusiasm in my voice, right? All right, so let's just to go over our paragraph and to reread it or proofread it, let's read through it and make sure that it makes sense. So I'm going to read it starting just from the title for you guys. Why do pollywogs wiggle? A pollywog is a tadpole, which is a baby frog. Pollywogs move by wiggling because they have no legs. Tadpoles have a tail and a mouth, but they breathe through gills. Tadpoles live in water or ponds. Wiggling helps tadpoles get around easily. They wiggle their tails like a fish. Over many weeks, they grow legs and change into frogs, but until they do, wiggling is the best way to get around. All right, how do you guys think that sounds?
Good.
Okay, so I want you guys to turn to, let me see, let me make sure it's in here, because it might be in your workspace. Okay, so I think you guys have your, that's okay, you guys have your checklist in your notebook. So let's go back to our desks for a moment. Okay, so as I'm handing you guys this, I want you to turn to page 79. 79, so 79 is going to look like this. It's going to have a checklist. Okay, just set it right here in my chair. 79. So you guys are gonna turn to page 79. Okay, so I want you guys to go over just the first, for now, I want you guys to look over just the first 5 of those criteria points. So it says, I'm looking at the column characteristics of effective information piece. So these are our different characteristics of informative writing that we want to make sure that we include in our paragraph. So as we're looking at our class draft that we wrote together, I want you guys to try to go over each of these points and say yes or no, I did or didn't, or we as a class did or didn't hit this point in our paragraph, and then try to write an example from the paragraph. So cite the specific sentence or phrase in the text that we wrote together that shows that or demonstrates that. So that's what you would do in the column right here that says characteristics of my paragraph about frogs. That's going to be our class paragraph that we're talking about, where it says my paragraph. So you guys are going to write an example from our paragraph of how we completed that, and then you're going to just check yes or no, or you can just draw like a little check mark and an X or an X. I'm going to put this back over here. You guys can see it fine. Over here, I believe. So we're looking at the class draft. We're looking at the one that we just put together. I know it says my paragraph, you guys, but you're not really talking about just your own. We're just talking about the class draft that we wrote together, where it says my paragraph. And that's just, you're just writing examples from the paragraph that we wrote to describe how we completed that characteristic. Okay, so let's read the first one. So look at our contract that we did together. So what if you have a sentence or this is from our paragraph that we did together? Great. So all we're doing is answering, did we complete this part of the checklist? And how did we complete this part of the checklist? Yeah, that's going to be where we just write an example of how we completed that part of the checklist. So like where it says, I see it focus clearly on the writing skills focus, that would just be where you would write an example of focusing. So somewhere in the text that we wrote, so we're just looking at the class draft, somewhere in the class draft where we really say focus. Which would probably be the what, right? The statement. Read the menu.
We're like,
close your workbooks. And, just pass everything like forward. And we'll make separate piles up here. So just pass all three of your book, two of your books and your paper, pass them forward, and then we'll make a stack of.
Okay.
Okay, you guys, and as soon as you pass your stuff forward, go ahead and line up at the door.